This is Clark County Judge Executive Chris Pace. I'm here with Congressman Andy Barr. Andy, how are you doing?
Judge, I'm doing well and healthy, and I hope you and everybody in Clark County is also as healthy as possible right now.
We are doing everything we can. Of course, you know, it's challenging times with COVID-19. I guess I'll start right in on it. How's it affecting your day-to-day life right now?
Well, it's obviously incredibly disruptive I'm not as much worried about me, but our constituents. I mean, for everything from families with kids at home from school to small business owners and their workers and their employees who have been forced to cease operations. And of course, many workers have suffered layoffs. We know over 26 million Americans have filed for unemployment over the last 4 or 5 weeks because of the economic shutdown. And then, of course, it's upended our healthcare system, obviously, and not just in terms of our heroic healthcare workers, frontline healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists who are treating COVID patients or COVID suspected patients, but also many of the hospitals and nurses and doctors that can't work because there's no elective procedures right now. So it's been a tumultuous time, and it's really upended life for everyone in Central Kentucky and across the country.
Yeah, it certainly has. You mentioned off the air a minute ago the resolution we passed in Clark County about trying to go ahead and move towards opening up business. I wonder what's the national perspective on that right now?
Well, there's a diversity of ideas, and of course, there's different places in the country where the virus has impacted the country differently. I think in Kentucky, obviously, we've been fairly successful in flattening the curve quickly, and that's a credit to our constituents who have done the social distancing, who have washed their hands and done the personal hygiene things that are necessary. I think the fact that we are a more rural part of the country makes social distancing a little bit easier. But the goal here should always be to flatten the curve, not to flatten the economy. And the way we should think about this is it's very different than a typical traditional recession. And in my conversations with the Treasury Secretary and Larry Kudlow, the president's top economic advisor, and the top officials at the Federal Reserve, including Jay Powell and some of the district bank presidents who heads up the St. Louis Federal Reserve, he has told us that the way to look at this is it's an intentional, deliberate shutdown of the economy by the government to respond to a public health emergency. It's not a business cycle phenomenon, obviously, and therefore it's justifiable for the government to intervene to provide, a lifeline or a bridge for many of the employers to help keep some of their workers on the payroll until we can safely reopen the economy. But as I said before, Jim Bullard, who is the president of the St. Louis Fed, he believes, and he's reiterated this to me in multiple calls, and of course the St. Louis Fed covers a good part of our area in Central Kentucky. He has said that there is a potential for a very rapid and powerful recovery because of the dramatic economic, fiscal, and monetary stimulus that has been put into the economy. And that's real credit to the very aggressive response by the federal government.
You mentioned that legislation. Is that legislation that you had a part in?
Yeah, Judge. So the federal response has been in different areas. So the executive branch, President Trump and his administration, they've taken a number of unilateral actions on both the healthcare side and the economic side. The Federal Reserve acted very swiftly, both in terms of reducing interest rates, providing some additional support through stabilizing the Treasury market, mortgage-backed securities, but also through emergency lending into the corporate credit markets, into asset-backed securities, and also in supporting Main Street lending through banks. And then Congress has responded with 4 phases of fiscal stimulus. The first was mainly to provide additional funding to the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, to accelerate diagnostics and work in the development of therapies and a vaccine with the private sector. There was some money for the Small Business Administration and the State Department to bring home some Americans who are stranded overseas. The second phase was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and that bill provided paid leave for people, provided free testing for people who needed to get a COVID-19 test, also provided a payroll tax credit for employers so that they could get reimbursed for the medical and family leave that many of their workers had to take. And then the third phase was the big historic response. It was the largest fiscal stimulus in American history, $2.3 trillion. And that included a lot of money for hospitals, $100 billion in hospitals, $45 billion in additional funding for FEMA, $150 billion for state and local governments, more money for the CDC. And then you had $500 billion to help the economy through the Treasury Department in as a backstop to some of these emergency lending facilities set up by the Federal Reserve, funding that would stabilize various parts of our economy. And then, of course, the initial $350 billion tranche of funding for this small business loan program, the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a forgivable loan program if you keep your workers on the payroll. That we went through that very quickly. 14 years worth of loans gone in 14 days, processed in 14 days, thanks in large part to the community financial institutions that really pushed out this cash flow and kept people on the payroll. It saved so far 30 million jobs and counting. 1.6 million small businesses benefited in just the first tranche alone. And then we had to come back to replenish these accounts in the fourth phase, which is really, they call it 3.5, but it was the Paycheck Protection and Healthcare Enhancement Act. That was an additional $310 billion to support the PPP forgivable loan program. And again, this operates as kind of like a grant, as long as you keep people on the payroll. And it also replenished hospitals to the tune of $100 billion, or I think $75 billion for providers. Both providers, by the way, that are helping COVID patients, and also providers who are sidelined because there are no elective surgeries in the effort to preserve personal protective equipment. And then an additional $25 billion for diagnostic testing, which is rapidly improving every single day. There have been over, I think, 30 emergency use authorizations for various different types of diagnostic tests. We've got over 70 FDA approvals of therapies, and we've got some vaccines already in clinical trials. So there has been a tremendous, forceful, aggressive, and powerful response from the federal government in support of our state and local agencies that is helping us get through this traumatic time in our country's history.
Now, I know you've been a proponent of the telehealth initiatives. Has that been included in this legislation at all?
No, that was just an action that our office has taken. So what we discovered when we first started talking to the epidemiologists in the Lexington hospitals was that we were really burning through PPE. And because some of the initial testing was delayed, and because we didn't know who was COVID positive or who just was symptomatic, and even some asymptomatic patients that came in who wanted to get tested, who thought they had it, that meant that all of the nurses, the healthcare workers, the doctors, they needed to don and put on and take off all of the PPE. They were burning through N95 masks and gloves and gowns very, very quickly. And so we immediately went into action. We called in additional help from the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We asked for reshipments from the Strategic National Stockpile. Congress, over the past 5 years, had appropriated over $32 billion in additional support into the Strategic National Stockpile. We were able to secure through HHS 3 shipments to the State Department of Public Health, additional shipments from the Strategic National Stockpile. You're talking about thousands and thousands of N95 masks and gowns and gloves, personal protective equipment. But because we were burning through
a large shipment here, and I saw that shipment come in on a trailer here in Clark County, so we want to thank you for that.
Well, good. I'm glad you all benefited from that. But I tell you what we learned from our doctors and from our epidemiologists is that we were still burning through it way too fast. And so there was an effort to conserve PPE to supplement the the resupply from the strategic national stockpile. And what they said was, we can do this through telehealth. We can use a Bluetooth stethoscope and good old-fashioned iPhone or iPad and FaceTime, and we can save a lot of PPE. So what they did was they would send in a single nurse with PPE protected, with a Bluetooth stethoscope, with FaceTime and iPad, and the doctor could save a lot of personal protective equipment and bring to bear this high technology to treat these COVID patients. So the problem was that the federal government was not recognizing this as an inpatient visit. So we were able to persuade the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to change the way they treated this as a physical visit, and they changed the regulations. So what that meant was we were able to bring modern technology to the fight against COVID-19. We were able to protect more healthcare workers so that they didn't have to go into those negative pressure rooms with the patients and keep them out of the room more frequently. And we were able to, all at the same time, conserve vast amounts of personal protective equipment. And so a real credit to CMS for seeing this, recognizing this, which is a solution that has been applied across the country. And a big credit to Dr. Mark Doherty at Baptist Lexington, who really innovated on this and brought this idea to our attention so that we can then advocate at the federal level.
Now, I believe that if I've followed it correctly through the news media, the thought is some states are going to be able to open up quicker than others. If I'm right on that, I wonder, do you have any thoughts if perhaps a more rural area like Clark County or maybe some of the eastern part of your district may be able to open up quicker than, let's say, Lexington or Louisville?
Well, public health and the safety of Kentuckians and Americans has been and will continue to be the number one priority. President Trump has certainly made that his top priority, even at the expense of the economy. But the truth of the matter is we have flattened the curve, and all of these fiscal response efforts from Congress, it's just not sustainable. We've borrowed over $3 trillion, and we cannot continue to afford as a country to continue to keep the economy shut down. So yes, we need to move into the three-phase reopening that the White House task force has laid out. It's very thoughtful. It's consistent with public health. It does prioritize and continue to prioritize public health, but it also enables us to restart the economy in those areas where we have successfully flattened the curve, especially in rural areas. And Clark County's done really, really well. It's a credit to the people of Clark County and Winchester, but it is time that we move into that phase one where people can start to go back to work, continue to social distance, continue to use masks if necessary at work. But it is time to get many Americans back to work. And we've seen many other states move in that direction. Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, Texas is starting to open up. We do see now elective procedures starting to happen again in Kentucky. And so we need to carefully and thoughtfully, but absolutely move towards reopening the economy, because nothing can replace getting people back to work, allowing them to pay the bills, put food on the table for themselves and their families. The PPP program, the loan programs, the fiscal stimulus and response and the rescue, it's all been very, very important to build a bridge to the other side, but we have to reopen the economy safely as well.
Is there any sort of a timeline in mind, or is that still something that it's hard to project when we'll be back at full go?
Well, as you know, what the federal government has done, what the White House Coronavirus Task Force has done, is they've put forward guidelines, 30 days to slow the spread. It started as 15 days to slow the spread. It stretched out to 45 days. And then the president unveiled, in consultation with not only his economic experts, but Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, the healthcare team, Secretary Azar, and others, a very thoughtful three-phase reopening strategy. And that phase one is a modest phase one where there's social distancing, where there's not a complete reopening, a careful, methodical reopening. But clearly, there are some areas that can reopen sooner rather than others, areas where they flatten the curve quicker, areas where we're in rural areas where social distancing is easier, where we've had a lower incidence of new confirmed cases, or a real recovery. Clark County is clearly one of those counties. We recognize that this pathogen knows no physical boundaries, and obviously we need to recognize that, but there does need to be a slow and methodical reopening in some areas, and clearly in the rural parts of the 6th District, that can start happening.
So one thing people ask me continually is there's this phrase going around, the new normal. And a concern that I personally have, and I think a lot of your constituents probably have, is some of the restrictions on our liberties. These aren't going to be permanent, correct? I mean, we are going to go back to, observing the traditional Bill of Rights, freedoms that we've generally had in this country, correct?
Absolutely. And as you saw, our Attorney General filed a lawsuit yesterday, and many attorneys general have done that, and to vindicate constitutional liberties. The U.S. Attorney General William Barr has stated very forcefully that some of the state-based restrictions are overreach and do cross the line. And so, yes, absolutely, we will be returning to normal after we defeat this virus. And there's a lot of promising therapies out there, and eventually there will be a vaccine, and we will be able to get back to normal. But in the meantime, the religious freedom of the American people, the Constitution does not bend to any of this. Clearly, local and state officials have broad police powers when it comes to responding to a public health emergency, and I think we've done a good job in responding to the public health emergency. But none of that justifies any violation of constitutional rights, nor does it justify, by the way, infringements on interstate commerce. And so I think we are approaching a time now where we've done a good job defeating this virus. We recognize it's going to be with us. We need to be careful and prioritize public health, but we also need to get this economy going again soon.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love the phrase that you used earlier, let's flatten the curve, but we don't need to flatten the economy. Another question I have is just looking back on how this all started. I know you've been involved with some legislation to investigate exactly what the Chinese involvement was in this. Could you explain that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, over 57,000 Americans have died as a result of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. We may now be actually approaching 60,000 of our fellow countrymen who have lost their lives to this very contagious pathogen. We've borrowed and added $3 trillion to the national debt responding over the last 6 weeks to this. Our economy has shed 26 million jobs. We've suffered under government-imposed lockdowns of our economy, and so the American people deserve to be compensated, and they deserve answers as to the origins of this virus. And we know that the intelligence community of the United States is now investigating the origins in that Wuhan virology lab. We know that 2 years ago, scientists from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing went to visit that lab, and they were so alarmed by the lack of safety protocols and the deficiencies in terms of the training of the scientists and the researchers there that they sent 2 sensitive but unclassified cables back to the State Department, and they said this could start a global pandemic. And sure enough, here you had it in December, where you had doctors sounding the alarm, whistleblowers, investigative citizen journalists who were arrested and disappeared. Dr. Lee, who was in a WeChat social media app, warning his other doctors about this strange, mysterious, new, highly contagious pneumonia-like virus that was going around the Wuhan hospitals. He was arrested. He was questioned by the communists in China, and he was forced to recant. He later died of COVID-19. We know that the Chinese Communist Party then lied about human-to-human transmission. They manipulated the World Health Organization to repeat that lie. They shut off travel from Wuhan to the rest of China, but they allowed people to travel from Wuhan to the rest of the world. And we know that one study says that if China had acted just a few weeks earlier to be honest and forthcoming about this with the rest of the world, that we would have seen 95% less cases in the world. So China lied from the very beginning about this, about the origins, for which they were responsible. They covered it up, and they enabled the spread of this pandemic worldwide. They put us all at risk. They put the American people at risk and the global international community at risk. They need to be held accountable. And that's why I introduced legislation to create a special select joint committee in Congress to investigate the origins and China's mishandling of this, their propaganda and disinformation campaign. And we need to be reimbursed by the Chinese Communist Party. We need to hold them accountable through various remedies like sanctions, like trade remedies. China holds about $1.1 trillion in U.S. treasuries as well. But the bottom line is they need to be held accountable, and we need to work with our international partners to move supply chains out of China. One of the things we know is we are over dependent on medicines and on personal protective equipment. And that's what's so sinister about this. After this virus escaped the borders of China and it became a global pandemic, we know that the Chinese started to hoard PPE and critical medicines, and they weaponized the global supply chain against the international community, including the United States. So one of the things that Congress needs to do after we have findings from this committee and recommendations, we know that we need to relocate critical medicines and personal protective equipment back to the United States and have a domestic supply chain to decrease our overdependence on China. And one final point here, Judge, that underscores how important this is. We heard from the Chinese Communist Party in January and what they were saying. And they said that they were going to put export controls on vital personal protective equipment and medicines, and they were going to throw Americans into a sea of coronavirus. This was an act of extreme aggression against the international community, including the United States, and the American people deserve answers and they deserve compensation.
Well, I want you to know that I personally feel more secure knowing that you're looking into that, and certainly it's a terrible thing if they weaponize and use that against us in those manners. I guess in closing, unless there's something you'd like to add, I'd just like to say thank you for your friendship personally and for your friendship to Clark County, and know that you've got a lot of people pulling for you and praying for you and your beautiful wife and daughters.
Well, thank you so much. We're praying for you, and we appreciate your leadership, Judge, and the leadership of the fiscal court there in Clark County. I know you all are doing the right thing, and we really appreciate your leadership, especially on safely reopening the economy, which has to be done. These lending programs are important, and they've been a lifeline to so many small businesses and workers. But too many of our fellow citizens have had to file for unemployment, and we need to get the American people back to work. And we appreciate your leadership there. I would like to just share one positive story and a big thank you, not just to you and the leaders over there in Clark County, but to our heroic healthcare workers who have put their own health at risk along the way. And I'll tell you what, one thing that it's amazing how many heroes are in our midst. We had a constituent from Jessamine County call us really in a state of panic. He worked for a pharmaceutical company that manufactures propofol, and propofol is the anesthesia or the sedative that is used for intubated COVID patients. So when a patient goes to the ICU with coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, and they can't breathe, they have to go on a ventilator, and that means they also have to be sedated with an anesthetic called propofol. Our country was becoming critically short of this anesthesia medicine. And this constituent from Jessamine County worked for a pharmaceutical company that sounded the alarm about how we were running out of this, but that his company manufactured this. The only problem was the manufacturing was offshore, and the Italian government had seized this shipment. We were able to have a phone call with Admiral Polachek, and Admiral Polachek is the head of the FEMA supply chain for the White House task force. We told him about this, And he acted right away, put us in touch with the State Department, worked with the State Department. We were able to work with the Italian government and get that shipment released. And a lot of it went to New York City, where they have a lot of COVID patients on ventilators right now.
Mm-hmm.
We were running out. Literally, the country was running out of this important sedative. We got a month's supply for the nation of propofol, which many anesthesiologists will tell you is the drug of choice for intubated COVID patients. So right out of Jessamine County, Kentucky, we had a hero who alerted us to this. We were able to work with the State Department, get this shipment to resupply to our country, and really save lives of people who are on ventilators struggling with coronavirus.
That just goes to show you that each one of us can find a way to contribute and save lives.
Absolutely, Judge. And thanks so much. Great to join you. Keep up the great work.
I look forward to seeing you in person sooner than later.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Looking forward to it. Stay healthy, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.